Remember those red lines back in July that followed Niger's coup? Well, they faded. France is reneging on its August refusal to pull its ambassador in Niamey. And now, after neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso, French soldiers packing their bags. West African states have long since gone quiet on their initial threat to intervene in Niger. So, what next for that country? Its people, its president, who's still under house arrest after being toppled in a putsch that seems to have been more about vested interests than national security. Where does it also leave the United States, which also has troops stationed in Niger as part of anti-terror efforts in the wider Sahel region? As for France, well, it's surely a moment of reckoning. Emmanuel Macron, its first president born after former colonies gained their independence, has had to grapple on the continent with a growing hostility, much more than against former colonial powers, Britain and Portugal. Why is it justified, and what's the remedy? Today in the France 24 debate, we look at what could be the end of an era, what with this domino effect of the French pulling their forces from French-speaking West Africa. With us, Niger Bakayoko, chair of the African Security Sector Network Consultancy. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Welcome from Washington, a former State Department advisor stationed in Niamey, Annalisa Bernard, Director of Risk Consultancy, Strategic Stabilization Advisors. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
From London, we welcome back Isabel Trick, Associate Director at Global Counsel. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, thanks.
And our go-to man when we talk about Niger, filmmaker and photojournalist Michael Kirtley. How are you?
I'm great. Glad to be back.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. A month of army rations and protests at the embassy gates are over for Sylvain Ité. That's France's ambassador. He's finally being recalled. 1,500 troops from France will follow before the end of the year. Fatika Bael has the story.
It's the end of all military cooperation between France and Niger. Those were the words of the French president, who said Paris will not be held hostage to the junta leaders in Niamey.
France has decided to recall its ambassador to Niger, who, along with several diplomats, will return to France. And we're ending our military cooperation with the de facto authorities of Niger because they no longer want to fight against terrorism.
The junta had ordered the expulsion of France's ambassador at the end of August, a month after President Mohamed Bazoum was ousted in a military coup. But Paris refused to recognize the military regime as legitimate. President Macron reiterated he still regarded Bazoum, who's currently detained by the coup leaders, as Niger's sole legitimate authority, and had informed him of this decision. The 1,500 French soldiers still on the ground should be gradually pulled out by the end of the year, and comes after the withdrawal of troops from neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso following military coups. It's a blow to the country's counter-terrorism operations in the Sahel, though Macron said France will push forward.
We will continue to support the African continent in the fight against terrorism, but we will only do so if it is at the request of democratically elected powers and regional authorities.
France's announcement was swiftly welcomed by the military regime, which stated it was celebrating a new step towards Niger's sovereignty.
Niger Bakayoko, you joined us last month when we were all surprised that Emmanuel Macron said, no, our ambassador's not leaving, he's staying put. Now he's going. Is that just simply that he's taken his licks and realized he's throwing in the towel? Or was this 1 month of stalling for time while France got its ducks in order?
No, I think it is another example of the new military governments being able to push France out of their own countries. It is exactly the same scenario as the one we've seen previously in Mali, then in Burkina Faso. But this time, the French president seems to think he could resist because of an international consensus about the need to restore Mohamed Bazoum as the legitimate president. But what happened is that, in fact, there has been very few support to French willingness, in particular, to push for military intervention. And we've seen that even the United States or other European partners have not been on the same position as France. And I think it is because of the lack of international support, including among West African states, that the French president had finally to resolve.
And just what do you think of the language that Emmanuel Macron used in that primetime interview on Sunday night? You heard that clip. He said of the coup leaders, they no longer want to fight against terrorism. Were those the right words to use?
I don't think so, because in fact we can see that terrorism, of course, or more accurately, jihadism is a major concern in the region, but it's not the only one. We can see that there is also problems with neighboring states. So, yes, the military junta in Niger has been, of course, very busy with what was happening politically in Niamey, but we need to have a bit more recall to know when exactly and how many attacks have occurred since 28th of July. So it is difficult for today to say, no, the military in power in Niamey don't want to fight terrorism, in my view.
Annelise Bernard, your thoughts on the way Emmanuel Macron has handled all of this?
I think that the way that France has handled this was, I would say that the first take in terms of not wanting to negotiate or deal with a, unconstitutional junta, a group of people who illegally usurped power. I think that was the way that probably the United States would have dealt with this originally. However, over the past 2 months, obviously that has grown to become a tired argument. So frankly, France has looked like they've made a bad decision in staying and digging their heels in as long as they have. I imagine that during—
Were you surprised by that?
I'm not surprised exactly, but I don't think it necessarily boded well for what could potentially be some back-channel conversations down the line. Ostensibly, France will probably work by and through the United States and other partners in the future in trying to maintain some kind of communication with the CNSP and others in Niger in order to ensure some kind of stability there. And holding on as long as they did not exactly bode well for any kind of potential conversation in the future.
Isabelle Trick, just again, to give our viewers a bit of background here, it was France at first drawing those red lines, but not just France. We also had regional powerhouse Nigeria and others saying enough is enough with these coups.
Yes, very much so. And I think it's looking as difficult for ECOWAS regional powers like Nigeria as it is looking right now for France. ECOWAS made that big threat of potentially intervening militarily. And it now looks like it's not going to happen. They now risk very much looking toothless, because the question really is, do they have both the appetite and the ability to intervene militarily? And right now, I think we're especially falling down on the appetite, because they're seeing a lot of support for the coup in Niger. They're seeing they're seeing a lack of support for military intervention among their own populations. But even on the capabilities question, I'm just not sure if they have it. These countries, many of these countries are already struggling financially. Their militaries are already stretched. Nigeria's military is very stretched with its own insecurity fight. And even if we look at something like the Gambia, which is a tiny country, they needed to bring together something like 7,000, 8,000 troops. And I don't currently see where we would get a similar number of troops or more troops for an intervention in Niger.
Now, Isabelle, options for the departing French troops who say they're going to be going by the end of the year will be to either what? Return home, redeploy to neighboring countries like Chad or perhaps Benin. Chad, just as you can see on this map, one of a host of former French colonies that still house French military bases. Your thoughts on what happens to the 1,500 French troops that are in Niger right now?
They're in a pretty difficult spot. They have already fallen back to Niger from countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, where they were previously stationed and where military juntas over there essentially expelled them, essentially drove them out. And Niger had already become the fallback option, and so much was invested in making Niger that hub. So now that they're unable to stay in Niger, it sounds like it would be a better idea to regroup, go back home, see what you're going to do before you kind of fall back to another country that might not welcome you. And seeing what we've seen in Niger, French troop presence really seems to potentially stoke anti-French sentiment. So I think it's going to be a very difficult calculation for whether you want to redeploy somewhere else in Africa or kind of take less of a military approach in the region and maybe not redeploy at all.
Michael Kirtley, over the years, France's presence in the Sahel has ebbed and flowed. We remember a decade ago when it was French troops that intervened to stop a jihadist advance on Mali's capital, Bamako. Can the Sahel get along fine without the French?
Could the Sahel get along fine without the French? I think that the question is, can the Sahel get along fine with its own governing bodies right now, with 3 military presidencies in Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger? How is it going already in Mali and Burkina Faso? From what I understand, not too well. So what can we expect more out of the junta in Niger than we've seen already?
But you heard Isabelle Trick saying how when the French are there these days, they just seem to be a magnet for hostility.
Well, of course, that makes perfect sense. But that wasn't the case nearly to this degree before the coup d'etat. Let's not forget that. I mean, before the coup d'etat, the French were seen as allies. There was a certain communication on the part of the Niger government that said the French were protecting Niger, and as been pointed out.
So what, did it change on a dime? Did it change on a dime, the feeling towards the French?
I feel that the junta did. I mean, these guys have very good relations with the French. Many of the military were trained by the French. They're not going to just suddenly say, I'm not French in many ways of thinking. What they did, on the other hand, is recognize they needed to call support for the coup that they had just done. So they turned French, as they did in Mali and Burkina Faso, as a kind of scapegoat in the street. I mean, today, if you go to Niger, I've been talking to 3 or 4 people today who are very high placed and very well placed to know. They say 90% of the population, and not just in Niamey, want the French to go. But there's another kind of.
So did Emmanuel Macron in that case mismanage the whole coup and what happened right after it?
Verbally, I would say he mismanaged it terribly, okay? Because what he did was act very arrogantly. At one point, he actually said, there would be no Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger without the French. I mean, you just don't say that in today's world, where you've got so much social media that's going to pick up on that, where you've got so many young people who really, they don't know how to see the French. I mean, keep in mind that the older generations in these countries typically saw France as a place to go get educated, or at least to play with when they're in trying to govern. The young people in Niger and elsewhere don't see France the same way. They may dream of going to France one day, but they don't have the background to be able to understand that kind of relationship that existed under France-Afrique, and certainly in the last 10 or 15 years.
It's not the last coup we've had since there was one since in Gabon. A quick question for you, Nyagere Bakayoko, on all this. There's one man in the middle of this all, and that's the ousted president, Mohamed Bazoum. Effectively, what we're talking about is the coup is now officially stamped a success. Where does that leave him? He's under house arrest.
Yes, and what is important to remember is that maybe one of the mistakes that was done by President Bazoum was to show himself too close to the French, in fact. Because, in my view, these anti-French sentiments that we can see all over the country today has been growing up for a long time, for at least 3 or 4 years. And there has been a major event, which was what happened in Terra almost 2 years ago, when a convoy from the Barkhane operation was very violently attacked by Nigerian protesters. And 3 of them were killed when the French military had to defend itself. And this has been staying in the memories, in the collective memory in Niger. And I think President Bazoum maybe within its own strategy, which in my view was rather smart, because it was both working with the French, but also with Russia, with Turkey. It was also not only fighting terrorism militarily, but also trying to dialogue with some or several jihadi groups. But what has been very badly perceived by the public opinion was its proximity with France.
Michael Curley?
And I think to go beyond what Niagale just said, I think that the problem today is not just facts. In other words, if we think about what really happened and what didn't happen, we're going to get lost. We need to think about what's being said on the street, the propaganda through social media and otherwise. And today, what does that propaganda look like? Perhaps before the fall of Bazoum, that propaganda was the French are, they're just bad guys for some reason or another. Today, the French are being taxed with causing the terrorist activity in Mali and in Burkina Faso and in northwest Niger. They're the cause. They're not there just to prevent it. They're causing it. And moreover, they're seeing many people in Niger are seeing the French as the cause of their economic woes. So the junta has a good pass through all this. France has been a scapegoat that they've taken a lot of very, very strong care to cultivate that scapegoat. Now with France leaving, that leaves them very vulnerable, I believe.
And it also leaves the United States without an ally, or if you're cynical, a cover. France's departure, forcing the U.S. to evaluate its next move in Niger. Lloyd Austin was in Kenya this Monday after Djibouti, part of a tour of the continent. Djibouti, where both the French and the Americans have military bases. Washington refraining so far from calling it a coup so it could maintain its military presence in Niger. Lloyd Austin was asked in Nairobi about the French pullout.
We really want to see a diplomatic solution evolve. We want to see a peaceful end to the crisis. And most important, we want to see preservation of Niger's diplomatically elected government. And so while we give diplomacy a chance, we'll also continue to evaluate any future steps that would prioritize both our democratic and our security goals. And these goals are intertwined.
Annalisa Bernard, continue to evaluate. Does he mean begin to reevaluate the U.S.'s position in Niger?
So first of all, this is going to be a State Department decision, most likely. It'll obviously include the interagency, but it will be driven by state. You have to understand that the U.S. really piggybacked off of France's approach in much of French West Africa, but specifically the Sahel and Niger. When I was there, our diplomatic strategy and our security strategy was predicated on much of what France was doing. So in the absence of an actual formal strategy that is US inherently designed, and that is also predicated on working by and through the existing government, I think that we can expect the US to slowly and kind of quietly downgrade its position in Niger. I was there in 2017 to 2019, and the US was already beginning what they called optimization at the time, which was the removal of much of our large special forces presence from both the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel. And by the time I left, there was already talk of officially at some point downgrading our formal presence from the Sahel and eventually moving it towards coastal West Africa. I believe that with France gone and with not having any kind of direct action support on the ground, because the U.S. was not doing that since Tango Jango anyways, that we'll see U.S. Special Forces eventually leave the Sahel, pivot out of Ghana, and eventually hand over AB 201 as well, which was the plan
so a couple
all
of
along.
questions, follow-up questions on this, Annalisa. First of all, why were they already starting to disengage?
So there's a lot there. A lot of it has to do with, I believe, by 2016 and 17, there was kind of the global war on terror was starting to see its end, and there was less inclination by the existing administration in Washington and politics here in Washington to continue to do this massive instrumentalization of a global war on terror abroad. So they were already trying to scale down the Lake Chad Basin approach at the time. Our installation was based out of N'Djamena for several years, and they had removed that back in 2017. After Tongo happened, there was also a reckoning back in Congress.
Tongo, was it 4 U.S. servicemen were
October
killed?
2017. Yes, on October 4th, 2017, 4 U.S. Special Forces were killed while doing a mission with a Nigerian Special Forces detachment in the Tillaberi region, close to the border with Mali and Burkina Faso. So after that, there was a political reckoning back in Washington that really just reinforced the fact that there is no desire at home, there's no appetite here for us to have a significant presence of security abroad in places that we don't have a theater of war and then we don't have a mission. And that's kind of the biggest problem. Is that
Annalisa, you're saying that the U.S. was piggybacking France's lead when it comes to assessing security. Then, and the question that follows is that like part of some trade-off where, because I know the French and the British have a deal where one country takes the lead in some countries and the other one takes the lead in others. What's behind the U.S. handing the lead to France?
Yeah, I think the U.S. has never fully prioritized its strategy towards Africa. It's always been formally focused on development and humanitarian assistance. Security always came second to that. And when it came to French-speaking parts of Africa, there was never the, I guess, mobilization of resources that we at least saw towards English-speaking Africa. And as a result, you just don't have the same level of diplomacy, the same level of interest, and therefore this focus on how to actually develop a laser-focused strategy for, a security operation in West Africa, let alone a whole of government one. If you look at Africa strategies and specifically Sahel strategies over the years, they're really just kind of repackaged versions of, the top line talking points that come out of generic European talking points of what we want out of West Africa, minus the migration piece even. It really has always just been about like a layer of border security coupled with some kinetic operations, but not much else beyond that. Our goal was always to shore up the capacity of the armies in these countries, but not to really do the same type of direct combat operations that the French have always done. We did provide ISR support to the French, though.
Right. Isabelle Trick, when you look at, because there are not just French troops in Niger, there's also there's Germans, there's Italians. Is it the same story?
I would agree. I think it's a very similar story. I'm less familiar with the French, with the German and other European troops in the region, but maybe to quickly add to something we just heard about the US. I do think it is interesting that the US, as far as I understand, has resumed some drone operations about 10 days ago out of its drone airbase in Niger, and I've heard American officials refer to this drone base especially, which they're not using to just kind of deploy drones in Niger or even just neighboring countries, but as far away as Somalia. And if that were to close down, that would be quite a blow for the US. So I do think it's worth pointing out that, as far as I've heard, some of these drones are flying again as of the last 10 days.
Does technology make it possible that you can be further away?
You probably can, yes.
Well, Niger's coup leaders are still fuming over the way the international community's treated them. Last week at the United Nations, they were refused a voice at the annual opening in New York of the United Nations General Assembly.
With the complicity of France and the two French-speaking heads of the state of ECOWAS, the Secretary General of the United Nations has blundered in the exercise of his mission by obstructing Niger's full participation in the work of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly.
Two French-speaking heads of state of ECOWAS. Who's he talking about?
There are several options, but I think he was thinking to the Togolese leader for Gnassingbé and also to the Beninese one, Patrice Talon.
So the
and
neighbors,
maybe also
basically.
exactly, and maybe also the Senegalese one, Macky Sall. But there has been lots of tension with neighboring countries, especially with Benin, with kind of struggle around the delivery of a humanitarian assistance. It seems that Benin has been denied to bring into Niger its own humanitarian assistance, which has been accepted from the ECOWAS sanctions, but the junta seems to have denied access to it. What is happening today, presently, because all the attention is mainly focused on fighting jihadism, terrorism. But we can see that there is also a risk of military tension, very serious, between ECOWAS member states themselves. We have seen that a new alliance has been launched last week
between Mali,
Burkina Faso and Niger, and it is both directed against foreign neighboring countries, let's say ECOWAS member states, which are willing to attack Niger, but also against some of the rebellions which are presently growing up again in Mali, for instance. So there is a major risk to see a global war, not a global war, but a global destabilization of the region, not only from terror, from a terror aspect, from terror, but also with a war, a conventional war, which could come again in the region.
Yeah, Isabelle Trick, let me ask you, how high are those tensions among ECOWAS neighbors?
I think it's certainly worth paying attention to that new security alliance just mentioned, because I guess there is the big question of if once France has left, and if the US possibly should leave, who is going to fill that vacuum? One option could be this new military alliance. But I wonder whether they actually have the capabilities to actually work together. There's talk about forming a new military architecture, building a new architecture together. That is difficult in the best of times. Then there's an option, can the Nigerian military do it themselves? They have been Western trained for the past decade and more, but equally the challenges are quite significant. Then there's a lot of talk about Wagner Group, especially now in the wake of Prigozhin's death. So far, I don't think there have been reports of Wagner Groups leaving Africa in significant numbers. Certainly haven't seen any intelligence reports to indicate this, whereas instead there's a question of whether the Russian military itself might try and play a more active role. We've seen the deputy Russian defense minister in the region recently, I think in the last 2 weeks, September 16th, he was in Mali. So there's certainly an interest to fill this vacuum, and this is only going to add to tensions between the military-led ECOWAS powers, our Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger's, and the non-military-led ECOWAS countries.
One recent coup leader who did get his turn at UN Week, as it's called in New York, was Guinea's strongman, Mamadi Doumbouya, putting away his usual army fatigues for a speech at the rostrum of the General Assembly, where he tried to steer Conakry away from the Macron versus Putin rivalry.
We are neither pro nor anti-American, nor pro nor anti-Chinese, nor pro nor anti-French, nor pro nor anti-Russian, nor pro nor anti-Turkish. We're pro-African, that's all.
Pro-Africain, c'est tout.
Annalisa Bernard, your reaction listening to that?
I think that was a very diplomatic approach to explaining where Guinea sits in this global power competition that we're starting to see play out right now in West Africa. I also think it's relevant that, Doumbouya, alongside several other African leaders, made the case that African countries need to be given a seat at the table in an equal seated manner and not be treated with this, as beneficiary states any longer. And that's kind of the take that I got from that. And it's something that certainly needs to be incorporated into when Western partners start to discuss how to engage these countries moving forward. These are not just recipients of aid anymore. They need to be part of the discussions on how to take things into their own hands.
Michael Kirtley, because Niger here has been roped into many discussions about the Russians moving in on France's turf. When you listen there to what Annalisa was just saying, again, what's the right outlook to have if you're a country like France and you're trying to rethink how you engage with the continent?
I think it's a very, very important question. And I think the way that, Annalisa just referenced something is the idea of being equal partners, equal discussion partners, equal in the way that you're perceived. And I think that in these countries, first of all, you have the population themselves, which today has become much more important as a political tool than it ever was in the past. And secondly, you have the rulers, the new rulers in the countries we're talking about. The question is not so much what can France do, but also what do those countries, what do those leaders want? It seems like that Mali and Burkina, especially Mali, has turned somewhat towards Wagner. That doesn't mean they've turned totally towards Russia, but they haven't started engaging so much with the French. They're still living off of this anti-French rhetoric, whereas the president of Guinea, you can tell he's taking a much more moderate position. I've always said that Niger was very different from Mali and very different from Burkina Faso. And so I think that there's a total possibility that France may be leaving militarily. It may, for the moment, be leaving at the higher diplomatic levels. That doesn't mean, France still has lots of economic interest in Niger. And I would say that Niger, in order to continue to subsist, has lots of economic reasons to stay close to France. And it's very possible in my mind that at least Niger could remain relatively on good terms with France once this is all over.
It might be an option, but in my view, not immediately.
Right.
Because what is happening today is not only about France's presence. It is more globally related to the relations that African countries are developing with external foreign actors. I think that Doumbouya speech is very important from this perspective, because it's just saying today we Africans don't want to be impeded by any alliance. What we do want, firstly, is to assert our own sovereignty, our own patriotism, our own strategic interests. And be it with France or with Turkey, as he just said, or with Middle East countries, etc. But what is important today is that we can see we are all focusing on, let's say, hard security. But I think that soft power is very important today. And what we can see growing in West Africa and maybe in all over the African continent is a very conservative approach, also from a societal point of view, which is very close to the position of some countries in the world. And I think it is much more interesting to look at why Russia seems to be very appealing today. That's not, in my view, because of Wagner Group as such, but I think because authoritarianism, as well as very conservative moral approach from, for instance, LGBTQ questions or gender are also congruent with what the majority of public opinion in Africa is trying to bring on the table presently.
Isabelle Trick, you agree that it's also Western values that African countries are rejecting?
Probably to a degree, or at least some African countries especially take offense at being preached to. Many of them might be very happy to espouse Western values in quote mark, but they don't want to be told they have to in exchange for specific things. I think it was the South African foreign minister in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war who took offense at being bullied, at being pushed around by the US to take sides. So when we go back to what we heard earlier about partnerships of equals, that is what many African countries actually want. They don't want lip service from Western leaders who put these terms, partnerships of equals, into the new Africa strategy.
Except, Isabel, here's the question then, all right? Mm-hmm. Niger, according to all those UN development indicators, one of the poorest countries on the planet. It needs outside assistance to pay its civil servants, to pay its teachers, to have programs for its health clinics. So, again, it's this question of to what degree you can assert what you're describing there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think the big problem is that if Western countries are becoming alienated and aren't as welcome anymore as African supporters, the question is whether countries like Russia or China or Turkey that might be willing to send military aid in Russia's case, or lend for infrastructure building in China's case, even though that is also decreasing, whether they will be able to fill that vacuum left by Western overseas development assistance. Personally, I'm not confident.
Michael Curley?
Well, first of all, the West is not out of Niger yet. Let's not kill the dog before he's gotten sick. The French were not in Niger until about barely a year ago. Okay, they didn't bring in all these forces until Bazoum invited them in. So it is true that this is a black eye for France. It is true that it's also a black eye for ECOWAS. Not just France leaving, but the whole way it's been handled. However, I think it's much too premature to say how this is actually going to play out. As I said earlier, the junta in Niger is not a revolutionary junta. They may say they are, but they have nothing to do with revolution. They're not fighting for values or against values. They're fighting for power. That's extremely important, I think, to understand. I do think, however, that if the West wants to maintain its any kind of influence in this area, it has to understand what's been said around this table, that if we're going to promote values, it's not to force values. It's, first of all, to teach values. How many times have I said in the Sahel, France and the United States and others promote the idea of democracy? In some countries like Niger, or Mali was in the past, or Burkina Faso was in the past, there were democracies there, but the outside countries did very little, contrary to what they've done in Eastern Europe, for example, to actually describe and to teach what it means to be in a democratic society and why it's important. This, to me, you can't just say to a population, especially one under 20 years old, be democratic, it's good for you. You have to show why it's good for you.
And at the same time, Annalisa Bernard, when you were stationed in Niger, was it strange to have currency in your pocket that was printed in France, the CFA franc, which is an association of states in West Africa, and the money's still printed over here?
I think actually while I was there was when there was talk of reprinting the ECHO, which never obviously came to fruition. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of colonial ties that still permeate through Nigerian and Sahelian society today that is creating certain cultural and social fatigue in these countries. And obviously, I agree with other panelists here that this isn't about a revolution, so to speak. I think that the junta is taking advantage of the popular support right now and the popular support against France as a means to make it seem like they're coming up with something revolutionary when, frankly, they're just covering up for the fact that a lot of them were about to be fired due to corruption expunges from the ranks of the government under Bazoum. But the point is that popular support for a lot of what the West has been imposing quite strictly on these countries for many years is obviously waning. And that just requires a recalibration of strategy back at home.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and that's but the French in particular are going for a hard time. That's why I asked you the question about the currency. Do you have this kind of anti-US hostility in the Philippines or anti-British hostility in Kenya, where for instance?
I don't know if it's to the same level. I'm also not an expert on those areas, so I can't speak to that.
But what is it about the French?
I think the French have also been quite ignorant. They've chosen to not listen to the popular resentment towards some of the patronizing takes that France clearly has towards much of French West Africa. I think that was part of it. You would hear when we would engage with our Nigerian counterparts who were also equal parts engaging with the French in Niger, you would hear them make the case sometimes that, the French didn't take their concerns seriously, or that they felt like if they asked for something, it would go in one ear and out the other. And then they would come to the US or they'd go to the European Union mission in the country and ask for the same thing. I think that just speaks to France was ostensibly their preferred partner in many ways, mostly because of the history of the close relationship. But there was this feeling that they weren't being taken seriously. And frankly, the US wasn't taking it seriously either. So I'm not really sure what we can expect in terms of how this is going to roll back on the US afterwards. But I do think that there was a sense that they were being patronized and belittled in many ways. And
let's take a look at the
this was the reaction.
Right. Let's take a look at the time lapse now, because if you were to listen to Annalisa there, it sounds like this could be a blip in the hostility of public opinion. Take a look at Mali. Its coup leaders who pushed the French out a year earlier. They've just also pushed back elections scheduled for next February. They're also angry, and we saw it last week, not just with the French, but also with the United Nations.
Inacceptable pour le gouvernement du Mali.
It had become unacceptable for the government of Mali to allow MINUSMA to continue to be part of the problem by aggravating tensions between our communities through the instrumentalization of human rights issues for political ends, serving external agendas belonging to countries that are hostile to Mali.
De pays hostiles au Mali.
Why this hostility towards the United Nations and its peacekeepers who are now on the way out?
I think there are two major reasons. The first one is what I was mentioning initially. It is because the tensions between Bamako on the one hand and Tuareg rebel groups on the other have never been as high as today. It seems that we are back to the situation we did have in 2013. So
is it a domestic issue?
Yes, it is a domestic issue.
It's got nothing to do with the Russians replacing the French.
No, it is a purely national issue, but which is not new with this junta. It is also important to say that, for instance, the French were very cross at President Ibeka due to his total unwillingness to apply the peace agreement with, which was signed in 2015 with northern rebels Tuareg. So MINUSMA has been seen as a kind of impediment for Bamako to reconquer the northern part of the countries. That's the first thing. The second one, where MINUSMA, which has been also failing from a number of point of views, has been very successful in pushing human rights. And this is one of the major reasons for which Bamako has asked it to leave, because it didn't want all the massacres and the human rights abuses to be denounced publicly and internationally.
What conclusions can we draw, Michael Kirtley, from what's happened in Mali? Is there anything we can project on Niger? I know you told us earlier not to confuse the two countries.
Well, of course, Mali, for example, is a country that has long been known to want to stay in total control of the North, meaning to not give too much autonomy, to not give too much governance to the North. They have been perpetrators of genocides against the Tuareg people in the north to a degree that is far surpasses anywhere else in the region. The Niger government has had rebellions, so they've gone to war and fought against the Tuaregs, but they've never gone in with the kind of terrorism against the population that the Mali government has. These attitudes have consequences. And I think that the problem with Mali is it wants to fight its dirty wars. And in fighting its dirty wars, it wants to get rid of the people that want to stop them, notably MINUSMA. The United Nations is not considered a friend in those particular situations. I was just talking to a former cabinet minister in Niger who said, I asked him, what does the junta want? And he said the first thing they want is for the people on the outside to tell them how to run their country in terms of human rights. I think that he's saying something there that's important. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that's another. So as far as the future is concerned, I'm very fearful. I'm very fearful that if things don't get brought into some sort of calm in Niger soon, we're going to see a situation in Niger that's very similar to Mali. In other words, the country sort of separates into various factions, various parts, some of which are totally at odds with the central government, and many of which are run by jihadi groups.
All right, on that unhappy note, we'll leave it there for now. Michael Kirtley, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Nyagare Bakayoko, Annalisa Bernard for being with us from Washington, Isabel Trick in London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.